for y'all that weren't on here the other night, we're going to reintroduce ourselves to the county agents that are on tonight. So, like I said, I'm down in Polk County here in Livingston, and I'm going to let Miss Casey and Miss Callie introduce themselves.
Hey y'all, I'm Casey Davis. So I don't have my camera going tonight, but I am the Ag Natural Resource agent, the only agent over in County in Pittsburgh.
Hi everyone, I am Callie Zeller and I'm the County Extension Agent for Agriculture and Natural Resources in Titus County, located in Mount Pleasant.
All right, thank y'all. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our first speaker. We got Penny Wilkerson, and she's coming from us from Texas Parks and Wildlife, and she is a certified wildlife biologist, and she covers Bowie, Case, and Morris County up there in Northeast Texas. So with that, Penny, I'll let you go ahead and take it away, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and it should be all yours.
All right. So can everybody, hopefully y'all can hear me all right?
We can hear you.
Okay. Anybody have any problems with my screen? Can you see my presentation already?
Yes, ma'am.
Awesome. Okay. So hopefully it's not going to take me too long to talk a little bit about this. First of all, I want to say thanks to all the extension agents who put this together, and it's a novel time. So we got to come up with some interesting things, and they did a great job here. So the first thing I guess that Matt wanted me to cover is a little bit about game and non-game. So for those of you that don't know me, which I think probably I've only met Casey in person. So I have been with Parks and Wildlife for 14 years here in the northeastern tier of the Piney Woods. And so I'm kind of finally getting my feet under me. But so I've been doing that for quite a while, and was luckily enough to be born and raised right in Cass County. But I did go off to school, so got back home as soon as I could. But and I think the other thing that I really want to make sure that you guys know is that if you've got a question, because this tends to be something that I like to talk about. So if you have a question, feel free to, I guess you can raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask a question, or type it in the chat box, and then Casey and Matt can help me kind of keep looking for those questions as they come up. So the most important thing with wildlife is that we basically have to plan. And then, you know, there are really a whole number of steps. But the first thing that we've got to do is figure out what our goals are. And then basically have to have a target patient. You know, in a lot of situations, what gets me in the gate at a new property is white-tailed deer. So 9 times out of 10 folks want either doe tags or they want to have bigger bucks. But we work on more than just white-tailed deer. So you don't have to have just one species that you're looking at. We can do a lot of different things as far as that goes. And then we have to look at what you have. And then what's limiting, depending on the goals that you set in that first section. And then we always have to create a plan. So that's one of the most important things that we do is you got to set your goals, and we have to have a plan. And then what we do is we utilize management practices so that you can have create basically what's limiting on your property. And then the last one that not a lot of people think about is actually making connections, and not just connections between habitats, but also connections for your neighbors, because the bigger pieces of property really make it a lot easier to manage for wildlife, especially something as big as a deer, or for something that's a landscape scale species like eastern wild turkey. So the first thing that we got to think about is what your goal is. And so I got on the screen kind of a list of all the different kinds of things that folks could have as a goal. And these are not things that are mutually exclusive. So I can work with quality buck management and in eastern wild turkey restocking. And I can work with timber production and all those things as well. You may not be able to have quite as much revenue off that timber as you had hoped if you want to have eastern wild turkeys on your property, but we can work with these. But just to start thinking about what exactly you want to come to your property is really important, right? And the other thing is there are some, right, as far as white-tailed deer, some goals that are mutually exclusive. Like you can't have quality bucks and have a whole bunch of does, right? So there are some things that you can't actually work together, but a lot of things do. So just being able to put your goal down on paper or have it in your head so that you know what you're looking for is the first step. So let's talk a little bit about habitat and about wildlife in general. So when we're talking about managing for wildlife, you really have to go back to the basics and think about what does this animal need to survive? Wildlife, whether you're talking about that huge alligator over there on the right, or my right, maybe your left, but anyway, so if you're talking about the alligator or you're talking about the frog, they all have to have food. And they all have to have water of some sort. Some have to have more water than others. For example, alligators, they need a little bit more water than something like a white-tailed deer who can get most of their water requirements from vegetation. And then cover is also very important, and it's more important for some species than for others. A lot of people talk about when we talk about the basics of habitat, they talk about places to raise young, because that's usually the most limiting factor in a lot of situations. But for cover types, if you're talking about white-tailed deer, they're easy. You know, how many folks have fawns in Austin when they live in Austin? I've got a friend down there that has had a doe come and bring a fawn and set it right in her garage. So that kind of thing is not very specific as far as needing cover that's different than anything else. But if you're talking about something like a bobwhite quail or an eastern wild turkey, there are very specific types of cover that those animals need, and based on their life histories, you can talk about the different kinds of cover that they need. And that goes back to setting our goals. If you want to have a brood of bobwhite quail on your property, then we have to have nesting cover, we have to have aerial cover from predators, and there's a whole slew of different things that those guys need because they're really picky. That and they're the ice cream of the wildlife world. Everything apparently eats a bobwhite quail, and that's why we have a hard time with those critters, because they just die like flies apparently. The last thing that all wildlife need is space. So that's something that wildlife biologists use the term home range, and that can vary, right? So given, for example, home range will vary seasonally with white-tailed deer bucks, and they'll also be a little bit different for does who are having to nurse babies or when they're pregnant. And so those requirements change a little bit, but most of the time when you've got a small animal like that green tree frog, you can generally say that it's a smaller home range, so they don't need as much space as something like an alligator would. And then there's generalist versus specialist species. So that's what I was kind of talking about, alluding to earlier as far as white-tailed deer. Yeah, they're generalist. They can eat pretty much anything. Sometimes you don't want them to eat anything, but they don't have a problem making a living off pretty much anything off the landscape. But when you talk about a specialist, for example, that could be a newt or a greater siren, who have to have a very specific set of habitat characteristics, like a salamander has to have a wet area 3 or 4 months out of the year all the time. So that's an example of the differences between species. But when we think about what we're talking about with wildlife, we have to go back to the basics. Do we have their food? Do we have the water that they need? Do they need some special cover? And is my property big enough for this animal to live? If you only have 5 acres, you could probably have about 20 green tree frogs, but probably not enough space for an alligator to live in 20 acres, especially if you don't have any water. All right, so I'm going to introduce you, maybe not, to a couple of terms. And when we talk about what an animal needs, we talk a lot about diversity. And so I'm one of, I guess, a typical wildlife biologist, and I really think that diversity is important on a property. And diversity just means variety, right? When I say plant diversity, that just means in an area that has 20 plants, it has more diversity than an area that has one type of plant. So something that's really important for maximizing the amount of wildlife that you have on your property is to increase the types of habitat that you have. And if you think about what Mother Nature does, Mother Nature has a very specific process where she changes, in some situations anyway, the plant communities that are in an area. And that's what we call succession. And we can actually manipulate the kinds of habitat we have by knowing about succession and knowing how disturbance will set back succession. So for us in East Texas, no matter where you are here in Cass County or down in Livingston, there's a very specific process that happens after disturbance. And generally, there's stuff like hurricane or wind throw events. Up here, we get a lot of ice storms that knock down trees. And then also stuff like intense wildfires. Those are disturbance level events that take down the tree canopy. And then we start over with a grassy area. And then the bane of farmers' existence are some of those woody plants like persimmons and sweet gums. And their role in succession is to change the amount of shade that's on the ground. So when you think about it, they're just doing their job. But if we introduce enough disturbance in an area that's been pasture for a long time, then we can keep that as a grassland. And so that's really important as far as, especially if you're talking about your target patient is eastern wild turkey, because their grasslands or open areas is something that eastern wild turkeys really need, and it's limiting in a lot of situations. So of course we have forests, we have plenty of forests. We have bottomland hardwood forests, we have upland forests, we have mixed oak hardwood forests, we have hickories, we have, you name it. And down in Livingston and in Jasper, in that area, we've got magnolias and palmetto forests down there that we even don't have up here to the north. But having different kinds of forests, like upland forests and bottomland hardwood forests, are really important for something like, once again, we keep going back to this, eastern wild turkey. And then wetlands. So if you're looking for specific recommendations to get waterfowl, you can have wetlands that have shallower pools and have deeper areas. And then you also need to be able to manipulate that water. So those are all important considerations when you talk to a biologist or you're a county agent and say, you know what, I'm really interested in ducks. I love to duck hunt. Well, we have to be able to manipulate water to be able to create habitat and food resources for these animals that come through and migrate. And the other thing is, like I said, disturbance. You know, we have to be able to input some disturbance into the landscape to be able to reset succession and make sure we have different kinds of habitat on our property. And really the first thing that you got to do is take stock of what you have, right? So generally, and it's really easy now these days with Google Earth, you got to, you can go on Google Earth and look at what your property is, right? So, and you know it, you know, if you've had your property for a good long while, you know that there's a creek in that west corner, or there's an area that's kind of overgrown, you have a right of way. But just knowing what you have is really important. And the other thing that's important is knowing what your neighbors have. So if you look at the landscape level, is everything but Bahia and Bermuda grass pastures, or are there some areas that are grown up in some native warm season grasses? So the other thing is, what can you do, right? 9 times out of 10, folks that live in East Texas have to make a living off their land. And if you've got to have those pine trees and they need to grow so that you can put your grandbaby through college, then we have to figure out, okay, you want those trees to grow? Well, here in about 15 years, let's thin those. Or where are the areas we can make improvements as far as wildlife habitat are? Do you have 1 to 2 acres that you can actually create spaces that are just early successional spaces? So a lot of times people use the areas where the loading docks, there it is, where they actually take the trees and load them up. And if you leave that space open and create disturbance in that area, it becomes a grassy area. And when you have all you have is trees, those 1 to 2 acre openings are really important. And the other thing is, you know, we can do pie in the sky stuff. I just put a grant in, and there are some grant programs out there that allow you to do some cost share assistance. And you can talk to your county agent, or you can also talk to your Natural Resource Conservation Service district conservationist, and they'll talk to you about some of those cost share programs that help you put these habitat management practices on the ground on your property. So on the right there, on the far right, you see a picture that's got what Aldo Leopold called were the basic tools of wildlife management. And Aldo Leopold said that what humans use to destroy wildlife with, we can recreate them. So a lot of that is the axe, the plow, the cow, fire, and that last one there, I should know, the rifle. Yeah, that's important. But being able to utilize those habitat management practices in such a way that we create habitat instead of destroying it is where we can go after we say, okay, if I've got that property in that red triangle there, it's a huge property. It's like 3 times as big as the property in the yellow triangle there, rectangle, but it doesn't have habitat diversity. So just like I was saying earlier, you know, what's more important? Is it more important that you have 300 acres of bottomland hardwood forest? If you want eastern wild turkeys to stay on your property all the time, then you kind of have to use some of those management practices to create openings so that you have the right food for your eastern wild turkeys to come and make a living there all the time. So I keep talking about wild turkeys, but they're a great example, right? And they're a good example of what we have to look for when we're talking about management, right? And so in the middle there, you see an eastern wild turkey poult. And the reason that these guys are so important, right, is because we want them to survive. And they're not quite as hard to get them to live as the the northern bobwhites. But you can tell how small this little critter is. You know, he is about as big as that leaf. But the limiting factor in East Texas, 90% of the time, is nesting and brood rearing habitat. Brood rearing. That's what I said. And the reason that is because at some point, a lot of people, you know, had to be able to produce lots of timber. And so what we lost was knee-high to waist-high grasses. And if you think about it, those mama birds need somewhere to put a nest that she can actually hide where she's sitting, but she can also see a predator coming. So a lot of times If something is too thick, it can be death for a turkey, because if they cannot see a predator coming for them, then there's not enough time to get away. So what we have to do is create knee-high to waist-high grasses for that nesting area. And, you know, even wildlife biologists, so I'll tell you a little secret, when we started reintroducing turkeys into the central piney woods in 2007, we thought we had it all figured out, right? We're going to do 10,000 acre blocks, and we were going to put these turkeys here, and she's going to have everything she needs. But students from SFA actually put backpack radio transmitters on those birds, and they found out that hens would sometimes nest in one area and travel 5 miles to find suitable brood habitat. And the reason that's so important is because when poults are young, that first 6 weeks of life, what they need to eat, 90% of their diet are going to be stuff like that little grasshopper over there on the side. They're going to need arthropods and crickets, and they're going to need all those insects that are high protein because they have to grow quickly. So what we've got to do is provide a lot of different kinds of habitat close to one another, is what we call juxtaposition, so that those mama turkeys and those baby turkeys have what they need close together. The other thing that's really important for turkeys is bare ground. So those turkeys need arthropods, right? Need those grasshoppers. But what brings grasshoppers in? Sometimes it can be those plants. So, you know, everybody's going crazy about pollinators and flowers. Well, guess what? Pollinators are turkey food. So not only do you have pretty flowers and the butterflies and the moths that pollinate them, but they can be food for stuff that are insectivores, like young turkey poults or swallowtail, not swallowtail kites, but scissortails. But the other thing that Bare Ground and Forbes are going to bring in are those critters. And then you've also got to have enough seeds around to feed mom and dad turkey, mom for sure. And then when winter times comes around, guess what you need? Bottomland hardwood forest, because the life history of that animal is such that they are going to need lots of different kinds of habitat. And that's one of the reasons why we need 10,000 acres to think about turkey restocking, which they have just done a great job in Titus and Franklin County. I think there's another county in there, but they actually did 2 restockings here recently. And those are great examples of some of the habitat work that's been done to increase some of the really most needed habitat. Okay, so there's our target patient. Now we have to create a plan. So what do we have, right? What's limiting? We're talking about turkeys. It's probably brooding and nesting habitat, but that's when you call your biologist. There's a biologist in every county in the state. Some of us have more counties than others, but that's what we're here for. We're here to say, okay, if you want eastern bobwhite on your property, usually we have to do pretty significant work to have enough cover for them. But that's what our jobs are. So we have to figure out what is limiting. The other thing when you're thinking about a plan is it is a long-term process. It cannot, I have one guy that has done more in about 6 months than some folks have done in 20 years. But it is a long-term process, especially when you're talking about these big, massive, what we call charismatic megafauna, like especially white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer take a long time to see the results of our management processes, especially when you're talking about only using hunting as a form of management there. And the other thing is it's trial and error. Look, I'll be the first one to tell you, I don't know everything. I've been doing this for a little while, but I'm still learning something new every day. And not everything that works for us up here in Cass County is going to work for y'all down in Polk County. I have folks that when they call me and say, what do I put in my food plot? A lot of people use turnips. A lot of people don't like turnips. So I'm going to tell you, you know what? Always use the mix and see what they eat. That's the most important thing is look and see what is being used and then vary your management accordingly. And that's the other thing, is what works best for you. You might not be able to thin your plantation pines at 15 years because it'll actually cost you money. So that's where the expertise of your county agent, biologist, your district conservationist comes in and says, okay, we can help you with this if we create a plan and we look at what's important for the future. And the other thing is utilize management practices. So the cheapest management practice we have in our book, other than hunting, is fire. And that's because it's just cheap. You know, you set it and you let it go. And we do it in such a way that it's very contained. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you don't have to do all the management practices at once. You can pick one and see how that works best for you. So I knew I was fixing to talk about prescribed fire. So here are some examples of what habitat management practices are. So when I come to your property, normally 9 times out of 10, the first thing that I'm going to say is you need burn lanes. And that helps you with your property because it creates an opening. So remember what I was saying? A lot of times people that grow trees don't have any openings on their property. Well, if we create burn lanes all around the edges of your property, then you've started to create an opening, maybe long and skinny, but animals are going to utilize that because guess what? It's open. And it's not just trees. It's got a herbaceous layer. So it's got grasses and all kinds of forbs and maybe a flower or two. The other thing that a burn lane is going to do is it's going to protect your property, because contrary to popular belief, or what a lot of people think, is in a forest situation, unless it's a very hot wildfire, which doesn't happen a whole lot, but what burns during a fire is the fuel that's on the ground. So what's going to happen when a fire comes up to dirt, it's going to stop. So dirt doesn't burn. And the other thing that it's going to let you do is it's going to let folks like Texas Forest Service come in and actually use the lanes that you've created around your property to defend your property. And so it also, if you're ready to do prescribed fire, it helps you to begin to start understanding the needs of conducting a fire. So when we're talking about prescribed fire, that's one of the reasons it's a very descriptive name. We don't actually call them controlled burns anymore because it's hard to control fire, but prescribed is actually a good word for it because that's what we do. When Texas Parks and Wildlife Department helps you with the burn, we do it, as far as in the piney woods anyway, we do it in a situation where we can teach others. So we want you to hold a workshop on your property if Parks and Wildlife helps you. And we do it under very specific prescribed environmental conditions. So we're going to know what wind speed and direction we need. We're also going to know we have a specific window for temperatures and relative humidities. And if any of those parameters are not what we want them to be, then either we're not going to ignite the fire or we're going to stop ignitions. And the other thing that's really interesting about fire, as long as I've been doing this, the more that I work with fire, the easier I get with it and the more comfortable I am with knowing what that fire is going to do if the wind shifts out of a different direction. So it's the best wildlife management tool we have in the book. And the other thing is not prescribed fire per se, but fire is a form of disturbance in every ecosystem in North America, with the exception of deserts and tundra. And it's always been had an important role in all of even the forested ecosystems. So another example that I like to talk to folks about, especially where there's a lot of haying or a lot of pasture lands up here, it's open field management. And so when folks are actually using their fields for hay or for cattle management, there are some things that you can do for wildlife, and that's kind of leave buffer strips around the area that you don't need to use for your haying or your cows. And here's another example. And burning it is great. And then providing kind of an area as far as that you might be able to keep some of those flowers or forbs in there. So this is a good example of one of the things that you can do on your property. If you have, this is a great example, like if you have a power line right of way, and guess what? That's an opening. You know, those gas line and power line guys do not want trees growing on where it's going to be in the way of their power lines. So one great example, and a lot of people love to use these as food plots, and they plant from tree to tree all the way in that entire right of way. But what I want to see is I want to see that right of way utilized as an open field, and utilized so that some of this natural diversity can grow inside this right of way. And so one example is that you've got a buffer of, it can be 1 or 2, basically their disc width. So if your tractor is 6 foot wide, you can leave that 6 foot buffer unmowed. And then you can come inside that right of way and you can disc align that 6 foot again. And what's good, why would I want to disc align? Well, guess what? It's disturbance. So that's going to bring in stuff like bugs and forbs, and it's going to bring in some of those natural native pollen, native flowering plants like that partridge pea that was on that previous slide. And then you can come inside and make your food plot. And it's cheaper on you because you don't have to have all that seed or all that fertilized, and you still have your food plot. And so a lot of times people have creeks or wet areas that run through their right of way. And so that gives us a good break as far as to how to change our management practices up on the other side of that power line right of way. So on the other side, you have a streamside management zone. So that's a good example of widen that streamside management zone up, because 9 times out of 10 in a right of way, you're going to have an erosion problem. And if you have a streamside management zone, you're not mowing all the way up to that creek or that wet area. You want to buffer it. So you want to keep those roots in place so that the soil will stay and that you won't have problems with erosion and really steep problems and dirt on your creek or downstream or something like that. But on the other side is where you vary your management practices. So you still have your unmowed buffer, but now what you can do is mow strips. And by changing the timing of that management practice, you've also increased the diversity of those plants that are coming up, because if you mow in May, you're going to have different plants respond to that mowing as compared to if you mow in July or August. July or August mowing is going to really benefit stuff like your cool season plants, and native warm season grasses are something that we think are really important for turkeys, for example, and they really don't start growing until mid-July. So right about now they're starting to grow really well. So it gives you a good example of some of the things that you can do maybe in an open field if it's a right of way, for example, or if you have a 1 to 2 acre loading dock that you don't have to worry about stumps on. But it gives you a good example of how you can use different management practices to create different habitats. So of course, forest management. In East Texas, the basis really for any good wildlife management plan is a forest management plan. And Texas Forest Service will do those for you for free. So, and that's where I come in as well. 9 times out of 10, the limiting factor in our forests is sunlight. So to get a plant to grow, you have to have sunlight. And the first thing that normally I suggest when I go to a place that somebody's just bought and it's maybe a 15-acre pine plantation, it's important to thin and take some of those trees out of the canopy so we can get more sunlight to the ground so that plants can grow. So we got food for white-tailed deer or whatever your target patient is. Daylighting roads is also really important, and it's super easy in a pine plantation situation where you've got that needs to be thinned. So if you have a road that goes through your pine plantation and you're ready to thin, you can actually just tell your logger to take out one row of trees on either side of that road. So either it's going to be 6 feet, sometimes 7, or maybe up to 10 feet. So you've created your roadway and maybe 10 feet on either side of that area, where instead of trees, there can now be grasses and forbs and flowers. The other thing that I want to say that's really important in forest management for wildlife, specifically for stuff like the red cockaded woodpecker, Louisiana pine snake, and stuff like the northern bobwhite quail, it's having longer rotations. So the life of a pine tree in East Texas right now is about 25 years. That's as long as it's going to be on the landscape. But if you've listened or read any of the early accounts of explorers in East Texas, they'll tell you that these trees towered over them. So these trees were probably 50 to 60 to maybe even 70 years old, and those were longleaf down in Matt's country, and there were shortleaf up here in the really high and dry areas. And what they had underneath them are what we call, it's a herbaceous understory. So those folks that wrote those accounts said that they had grasses that hit their horses in the withers. So those kind of grasses we don't have anymore. But when we start introducing prescribed fire in the understory of some of these longer lived trees, then we can start reconstructing some of that really early ecosystems that were here 150 to 200 years ago when explorers or European settlement first started. So, and that's important, like I said, to some of these most imperiled species because it increases the actual habitat. So that's the other really cool thing that not a lot of people think about is you can vary up your habitats by holding onto your trees longer. You've got a canopy above it, and you actually also have a grassland habitat underneath. So a few other habitat management practices that we can talk about. Mulching is super expensive, but it's really effective. You don't have to worry about stumps. And in a situation where you have a forest stand improvement coming up, a lot of people can use that to create burn lanes, for example. Moist soil management, so that's kind of what I was talking about as far as wetlands go. That's a great management practice, not just for waterfowl, but also for amphibians. And then pollinators, of course, not just pollinators and not just pretty flowers, but also turkey food and food for animals that eat insects. And then there is a great push for forest replanting. So I just mentioned that there's longleaf pine and shortleaf pine, and those plants don't grow quite as fast as loblolly, and loblolly is everywhere now and grows real fast. But there's been a huge push in the last 20 years for planting for planting longleaf and shortleaf pine where they would naturally occur in sites that maybe aren't the best to grow loblolly. So, and there are some incentives that offer up to 75% cost share assistance if you want to plant shortleaf. And so shortleaf pine is something that's more geared to folks that are actually interested in stuff like wildlife management, because it requires a little bit more interaction with other management practices, and longleaf has to have fire on it. But so it's a little bit different management scheme, but it's definitely something that if you're interested in, you should talk to your biologist or your county extension agent, because we can do really good things with those replantings. Okay, so a couple more slides here and then I'm going to shut up. But what are you talking about? Like, what can I specifically do for non-game? So here is an example of creating a bird habitat. And so I pulled a cool landscaping picture off the web, and it shows you kind of something that's really good as far as providing different kinds of habitat in your backyard. So we go back again to those 4 basic principles for birds, right? If you want a bird habitat and you want to have as many birds as possible visit your backyard, then you can't just give them birdseed, because not everything eats birdseed, right? So I actually have an interesting backyard, is because I have pasture on my left and I have a regenerating clear cut just behind me. So I get these scissor-tail flycatchers and bluebirds all the time because I have June bugs out the wazoo. But you have to provide those guys the food that they need so that they'll come in. And that's, once again, we have to start thinking about what our target patient is. So by increasing the diversity of food in your area, you can increase the different kinds of birds that come in. So having seeds, berries, insects, and having those pretty little flowers that provide nectar for your hummingbirds, having all that in your backyard is going to increase the amount of birds that you have back there. And then also, when you change that cover type or habitat type, you're going to be able to see different critters, right? So if I didn't have pasture on my west side, I probably wouldn't be seeing my scissor-tail flycatchers, or I'm seeing a lot of purple martins too. But having that different diversity of habitats right next to my backyard allows me to see stuff like cardinals. Everybody's got cardinals, but I get to see bluebirds and scissor-tail flycatchers. Sometimes I get Mississippi kites as well. So just keep in mind, having variety is one of the most important things for providing for different kinds of animals. So for non-game, here's another thing that a lot of people like to see, those little critters, creepy crawly critters, and they like rabbits a lot. I've got some folks that actually have created a brush pile just for rabbits. And so there's a little example there on the left-hand corner of how to actually build a really great brush pile for something like a rabbit. And then, not that we have pheasants, but you can see that it'll provide habitat for other critters too, and that does provide habitat for birds as well. But when we're talking about mammals and reptiles, that's the other thing, is keep in mind that the ecosystem is full of critters that eat other critters. So you might see a red-tailed hawk, or you might see a sharp-shinned hawk or something like that in your backyard, and they might be looking for dinner. So just keep that in mind when you're providing habitat in your backyard. Once again, as far as reptiles go, and they need water source, especially, and I tell you what, I've gotten really familiar with gray tree frogs this spring because I have a pool in my backyard, and I've never seen so many tree frogs. But having a source of water in your backyard, generally you want it to be constant. But the other thing is you can have an area that's ephemeral, so it can dry up later in the summertime because you've already provided an area for those frogs to do what they need to do around those ephemeral ponds. All right, so I've got one last slide, and then I'll provide you guys my contact info. So the last thing that's really not on a lot of people's radar is how important it is to make connections. So the number one threat in North America to wildlife species is habitat fragmentation. And when you make connections between habitats, that already increases diversity. So a lot of times these animals use corridors as superhighways to move, and plants, believe it or not, have a tendency to move as well, even though you think, what is she talking about? Plants don't have feet. But the seed dispersal is also important. But so when you're looking at your habitat or your property, if you have a fragment of forest on your property and there's bottomland hardwood forest, or maybe a creek in between your neighbor's property that has a little section of forest, creating a streamside management zone around a creek gives a great corridor to connect those habitats, and it actually instead of having 2 fragments, you've created one large area of habitat. And the other thing is work with your neighbors. You know, a lot of times you'll figure out that you have a like-minded neighbor that knows just as many bird calls as you do. But working with your neighbors so that you both get on the same page as far as creating habitat is really one of the best things that you can do as far as managing game and non-game right there in your backyard. So with that, I'm gonna close out and let you guys ask questions if you have any, and my contact info is on the screen. I am biologist up here in this northeastern corner. There is a biologist in your county. If I'm not your biologist, I will be more than happy to provide you their contact info. So you can send me a text or give me a call or send me an email, and I'll tell you who your biologist is and be happy to work with you about any general questions you have. So with that, I'm going to.
Well, thank you. That was we enjoyed that.
Great.
So does anybody have any questions?
No, I put everybody to sleep.
No, I think you did a really good job.
I have a question. I apologize for making it in late. I've had some issues with my computer and then with the link, so I couldn't seem to get it downloaded, and it was just a lot of craziness. I missed almost everything, and I noticed that it was being recorded. Is there some way that I could view it also at a later time? Is that going to be something we're going to have access to?
Yes, ma'am. We're gonna get once we get all of these the whole series finished, we're gonna post them on YouTube and we'll share that with you.
Okay, and then I had another question, and I didn't want to ask too many questions because, you know, I missed most all of it, and but
Go right ahead.
I'm really excited about this series because we have about a 1/4 acre that we're going to be using for vegetable growing and things like that. We have a creek on the back of our property that dries up, but it's, you know, it's mostly for flooding, and so we didn't want to discourage you know, the wildlife, but at the same time, you know, we've got a bunch of kids. And what are your recommendations for kind of coexisting when you're going to be using you know, your land for growing vegetables and fruits and things like that, without, you know, without putting a strain on either the wildlife or, you know, us breaking ourselves trying to keep animals out of it.
Right. Yeah. So that's, you know, it's funny because critters just know like you're trying to grow something. My mother-in-law has a garden right now, and she cannot keep the deer out of it. Like they eat her bell peppers like they're going out of style. But so long as the most important thing is that you have to try and discourage them from getting in there. So a lot of people, something that I found that is really the most effective is actually putting a little bit of an electric fence up. And I have a lot of folks that actually do that with their food plots. So it's something that they put their little bit of a charger on a piece of fabric tape and electrify it, and that is just enough of a deterrent to keep the deer out. So whatever you've got can get established, and that would be probably the most effective deterrent as far as keeping deer out of your garden. You know, because there's a ton of other things that you can try, but for example, there's pie plates, and you can put one of the things that I always suggest too for birds is to put an owl up. But I think in your situation for a vegetable garden, you might try electrifying it and do an electric fence and see if that helps.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Anybody else?
I'd like to plug the motion sensing spray system. I put one of those up above our garden, and I can't tell if the deer have gotten into the garden at all in about 2 months now.
Oh,
It senses motion at night and sets off the sprayer
love it.
just for a few seconds, but it's enough to keep the deer at bay.
That's a new one. I'm excited. I'm going to tell my mother-in-law about that when I get done tonight.
What does it spray?
Water.
Does it spray water, Wally? I would assume.
Yeah, it's got a pressurized hose to it, so it's a ratchet type sprayer that just runs for a few seconds, and it surprises them is the main thing.
Gotcha. Hey, Penny, one person asked, who's the biologist in Marion County?
Sure. The biologist in Marion County is a gentleman named David Campbell. His email is going to be the same as mine. It's going to be david.campbell@tpwd.texas.gov.
I got it. I'm going to put it in the chat. I pulled it up on your
Perfect.
website.
Yeah, that's actually, can you share that website? That Find a Biologist website is really helpful.
Yes, I'll share it right now. All right, y'all. So I'm putting in the chat the link to TPWD's website, and you can click on what county you're in, and it'll pop up who's your biologist is for your county.
There you go. Good deal.
They're all excited about Wally's sprayer setup. I'll ask one question for you, Penny. I get a lot of calls a lot of times from people that, I mean, you know, we got a lot of Bermuda and Bahia grass fields just like y'all have up there. And we got turkeys in the county, and they think they want to try to get turkeys on their own land, and they go to a program and they kind of get disappointed, or I tell them, you know, they really don't have the right stuff for turkey or quail or all that. And I guess my question / comment is a lot of times I tell them 2 simple things they can do is try to like keep the edge of their field, you know, don't spray Roundup on their fence lines, kind of let their edge lines grow up. And the other thing is to give, you know, maybe not go shred their pasture every 30 days, you know, maybe wait till like in July or something like that. I guess just what's your opinion on that? Is that something you think would work, or am I just telling them stuff that's no good? Or
No, I mean, you're spot on. I mean, because 90% of the time people think, oh, I have an opening, it's Bahia grass. I got this, it's okay. But what we need to think about, again, that's why I was talking about diversity. So it's just like a monoculture, you know, Bahia and Bermuda grass, you got 1 or 2 species in that whole hayfield. And sure, your Bahia grass makes a pretty decent seed. But when we're talking about some of those critters, first of all, bobwhite quail, like I say, they're the ice cream of the wildlife world. And if you don't have somewhere for those guys to hide, those hawks are going to pick them off like who'd have thought it. We don't have any left. So by creating habitat around your fence lines, that's important as far as cover from aerial predators. So that's really important. That's the first thing that you got to do. And that's what you're doing by not bush hogging all the way up to the edge of your fence, is you've gotten some cover for those critters. And that's one of the first things that they can do, is just don't shred that every 30 days. And and also by having that cover on the edge, that's the other thing that's really important. So that's definitely a first step that you've found there.
okay. And then just kind of add on to what your kind of last slide was about with making them connections. And especially for y'all that are listening down here in Polk County, we have, like Penny said, we get a lot of interest from new landowners with longleaf, and then they kind of see how many acres they really need to make a difference, you know, to get turkeys and all that good stuff like that. But I preach this all the time. So for y'all that are in Polk County, for sure, if y'all would see how many people I come through this office that got 10, 20, 30 acres that want to make a difference, and then they get disappointed because they don't really have enough acreage. If y'all could all get together, y'all would have a lot of land to really do something, especially down here in Polk County, because you'd be surprised, we're getting more and more people out of Houston that they're not interested in, making cows or hay or anything like that. They're interested in doing their part for the environment. So if y'all see people on here that, maybe reach out to them in the chat or something, or if y'all recognize a name. So that's all I got, unless anybody else got any more questions.
I got a question. I'm a transplant and I'm in Polk County. Where I grew up, it was high desert. So all the water, I was so excited because that's a huge thing for us. I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much water to do so much with. And I didn't realize that, there's water moccasin and pretty much everything else that lives in that water. So, how would you suggest using any kind of water catchment on our property and still discourage those water-loving critters from swimming in it?
Penny, I unmuted your mic by accident, so we can't hear you. I don't know if you can hear me. I did that by mistake. Sorry.
No problem. No, I was going to let you answer that question.
No, I think you're the professional biologist. You go for it.
Well, good question. So if we go back to those four main components of habitat, you're providing the cover that they need. So it's a little bit harder to take away that food. But that would be my main thing to suggest is look at the food components and try and take away that food. And it's hard. I mean, water moccasins are one of the generalist species. So they pretty much eat anything. They eat fish and frogs. And, if it's wet, you're going to have those critters that are there. And I think that's probably going to be maybe a long-term issue that you might have. But I think that the other thing that's important with water moccasins is, something around your house. You might want to make sure that you don't have any places where they can hide. 9 times out of 10, when somebody calls me and they say they want to control their snake population, it's like you have to have some defensible space around your home. So, make sure you don't have brush or tall grass or stuff like that in an area that you're going to be going frequently. You know what I mean? So you may have brush kind of around some parts of your pond or water catchment, but as long as you've got kind of a path that's always mowed down, then hopefully you'll be able to spot those critters before they come. But it's going to be hard to control water moccasins if you have water, for sure. But yeah, I would go back to try and limit either something as far as food resources. But that would be my main suggestion. And like I say, don't provide them cover, because if they're not hiding, then at least you can see them before they get to you.
May I offer something as a newbie to the country myself? We have a water snake, which some of our visitors have mistaken for a water moccasin, so it's good to know the difference between them. And the thing that I look for most is at the jawline. The good water snake has horizontal marks along his bottom jawline. Not horizontal, I mean vertical. Yes. Yeah, so if you get close enough to see that, you'll know that he's not the dangerous water moccasin.
Good point. That's a great point.
I appreciate that, but I don't like to inspect them.
I understand. Me neither.
Rattlesnakes they'll take a leap. So I don't even, if I see them, I'll go the other way.
I understand.
Well, Nina, I don't know if I should tell you this, but we got rattlesnakes in Polk County too, so. All right, so if we don't have any more questions, I think we'll go ahead and jump over to our next speaker real quick. Our next speaker is going to be Miss Olivia Wood, and she's going to talk about the Master Naturalist chapter I have down here, and then just some of the some of the stuff they do as a chapter, but y'all could relate that to like projects that y'all could do for y'all that have like small backyards or small properties, just simple stuff that y'all can do. So with that, I'll let Olivia take it away. She's probably pulling up her screen right now.
This is Wally. I've got one last comment on the snakes.
Go for it, Wally.
We have two Chiweenies, little dogs that live next door to us, and they let us know when they're the snake patrol. They end up let us know. In fact, they've alerted me to water moccasins, and of course the diamondback water snakes they're common, but we don't get that many water moccasins, but they'll find them if there's one out there.
All right, thank you for that, Wally.
Good.
Olivia, are you ready to go? All right, I'm coming over there to get it for you.
While they're getting that set up, this is Casey, the ag agent in Camp County. If all of y'all who are new tonight could put in the chat box, more than one watching on screen, so we kind of have an idea. Anybody else, we'd like to know where you're from. So please drop that in the chat box there. And again, on your little screen, it's looks like the voice bubble. You just click on that and
Casey, we're going to go ahead and
you.
get started then. So,
ready to go.
all right, it sounded like we lost you. All right, go ahead.
Okay, can y'all hear me? Uh-oh, says my network is causing poor quality. The heck? Okay, how am I going to be able to hear?
I've been getting that message too. Hopefully
Casey,
y'all
can you hear us though?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay.
All right, you should
Okay.
be good to
Good.
go.
All right, thank you.
I'll let you know if I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, hi everybody. My name is Olivia Wood, and I am a Texas Master Naturalist. I live in Point Blank, which is in San Jacinto County, if you know where that is. Been a Master Naturalist since 2014, and I just would like to share with y'all a little bit about the Texas Master Naturalist program in case you don't know. Master Naturalist program is a volunteer training and development program jointly sponsored by Texas Parks and Wildlife and the Texas A&M Extension Service. It was started in 1997, and it now has grown to include 48 chapters, which cover 213 of the 254 counties in Texas. As you can see on the map where your county is, the white counties are counties that don't have a chapter, but the others do. So there are currently over 12,800 certified volunteers. The main goal of the program is to develop a core of well-informed volunteers who bring natural resource education, outreach, and service to their communities throughout Texas. Texas Master Naturalists are individuals who love nature and want to share that love through education and service to our communities. Our chapters work with communities and organizations in their local area to implement youth outreach programs, to help operate parks, nature centers, and natural areas, and to lead local natural resource conservation efforts. My chapter, Piney Woods Lakes, includes Polk, San Jacinto, Trinity, and Tyler counties. Some of the projects that our members participate in include the Ag in the Classroom, as you can see here. We have participated in the Texas Forestry Festival, again as part of our public outreach, and assisting with events at Lake Livingston State Park, including things like this Bird of Prey exhibition. Some of our members volunteered to help out with cleanup following the tornado that hit out at Caddo Mounds State Historic Site last year. And we also have members who write articles about nature for various publications and who speak to local groups. And also our chapter was instrumental in forming Friends of Lake Livingston, an organization that is working to improve the habitat in the lake through the placing of aquatic plants. And also many of our members participate in various citizen science projects, which I'll get to in a minute. If you're a new landowner, Texas Master Naturalist can offer you the chance to gain a broader scientific understanding of your property and the ecology and management of the wildlife. It's just an additional resource to your biologist. And the website is up there in the corner. You can go to that website to find out about a chapter in your area. And even if you don't want to become a Master Naturalist, you've already seen here that there are lots of ways that you can make your property more friendly to your local wildlife. And I'm pretty sure that's something y'all probably are all interested in doing. One way would be to create a backyard wildlife habitat. Penny talked about habitats on a much larger scale, and she did touch on the backyard wildlife habitat as well. Whether you currently live on your property full-time or you just visit when you can enhance the habitat to make it more welcoming to the local birds and other small animals, as well as the deer, the turkey, the bobwhites, all those other guys. Okay, sorry. So the three things you need to provide in your habitat, as Penny said, are food, water, and shelter. Space is also an important thing, but we're kind of talking about smaller animals here, so the same thing that applies to large habitats also applies to small habitats. If you don't live on your property, you can't really just use feeders to feed the wildlife. So you'd want to plan and plant even a small area. As you can see here, the birds and the insects are getting seeds, nectar, pollen, fruit from the various things that you've planted. And as Penny also said, the plants are going to attract other invertebrates that will also be serving as food for your visitors to your backyard habitat. When you're considering what to plant, it's important to remember that native plants, once established, are always going to require less care and be more compatible with your wildlife than non-native plants. And the Native Plant Society of Texas is a good resource for finding out about things that would be compatible with your area. I've listed their website down there as well. So don't hesitate to contact them. If you're lucky enough to have a water source, such as a pond or stream on your land, that's great. You might have to put up with a few snakes, but you know, it's all part of the deal. If you don't, you can provide water sources by the use of bird baths, which again is hard to do if you don't live there full time. Or you can consider putting in an artificial pond or even a rain garden that would help out with that. And of course, wildlife also needs shelter, a place to hide or sleep or just get out of the rain. Natural shelter such as rock or brush piles, hedges, tree cavities are welcome. So you might want to think about leaving some of that stuff intact as Penny said, when you're considering what you're going to do with your land. In addition, you can provide man-made shelters, such as birdhouses, or even bat houses, bee houses, toad houses, and I think up here on the right-hand corner you can see a rabbit shelter as well. So as you can see, there are a lot of small-scale backyard type projects that you might like to try. Now, there are also many citizen science projects that anyone can participate in. Citizen science is nothing more than the engagement of ordinary people in collecting data for scientific investigations. And one example of citizen science is CocoRa's, which is the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. That is a database that was started at Colorado State University in 1998. CocoRa's collects data on rainfall, snowfall, and hail from volunteers in all 50 states, as well as Canada, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Bahamas. And their data is used by the National Weather Service and other meteorologists, as well as by local emergency managers, city utilities, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, any entity that's interested and needs to know about rainfall. If you go to the website, cocoras.org, you can look at rainfall data for thousands of spots around the country. And as a CocoRa's volunteer, you would install a rain gauge on your property and enter your rainfall data daily in their database. And I don't know about you, but there have been plenty of times when I have seen rain just falling like crazy very close to me and I don't get a drop, which is frustrating. But it's also interesting because you can go on their website and put in your county and you can see all the places in the county where registered volunteers have their rain gauges, and you can really see that, yes, I got 0.2 inches of rain, and you know, half a mile down the road they got 3/4 of an inch, which hardly seems fair, but you know, sometimes that's just the way it goes. And let's see. Another activity that many of our volunteers enjoy participating in is Project Nest Watch. And that's a nest monitoring project that was developed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Have you ever had those noisy wrens, those Carolina wrens that make a nest in your hanging basket? If you have a nesting birds anywhere that you can safely observe them, you can log the location on Project Nest Watch, and you can observe the nest and report the data. And they do monitor bird populations in that way. And if you put up a nest box on your property, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner there, you might be lucky enough to have bluebirds or titmice or chickadees or other birds that move in and raise young there. And all of these pictures are bluebirds, but there are other birds that nest in those cavities too. And it's really fun to observe them and just watch them as they grow, and it's interesting to watch and see, and you can report. And that it does help them to keep up with the populations. Okay. And in addition to CocoRa's and Nest Watch, there's another one called Project Feeder Watch, which is another project of the Cornell Lab. Feeder Watch is done in the wintertime from November through April. And basically what you do with that one is watch, observe your bird feeders. It's an excuse to sit and watch the birds come to your feeder for a couple of hours, and then report it to the database. And it's another way that they're using to keep track of bird populations. There are also some web-based activities, such as iNaturalist, which is a joint program of California Academy of Sciences and the National Geographic Society. They maintain a worldwide database of plants and animals, and you can go to inaturalist.org and enter any location, such as the county where your property is, and you can see a listing of the plants and animals that have been observed by other volunteers in your county. And of course, if you become a volunteer, you can also contribute your data to their database. If you use the iNaturalist app, you can take a picture of a plant or animal and get back a list of possible IDs for it, which can be interesting. Sometimes it's kind of frustrating because they do use artificial intelligence to do the recognition. So once in a while, you'll send them a picture of something, and it comes back with a completely crazy possibility, like you send a picture of a vulture and it comes back with, well, that could be a bear. But the more people contribute data to it, the better it's going to get, and it's already really good. There's some other web-based programs. One of them is eBird, which is similar to iNaturalist. It's another project of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which, if you're interested in birds at all, highly recommend going to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology website, which I've listed down there. They have all kinds of information about birds. They have little online classes that you can take. There's a Merlin bird ID app, which I love. I have it on my phone and I love it. And it's just, it's really great. It's like having your bird ID book in your pocket. There's also a lot of other websites and Facebook groups and things that will give you some really good information about various animals. There's one called Texas Turtles that's on Facebook that is a very good one for identifying all the kinds of turtles you have. There's Herps of Texas, which has basically amphibians and snakes. And I honestly don't know if they're on Facebook or if they're just on a website. There's a Southeast Texas Snake ID that's a really good Facebook group if you want to learn how to identify snakes. And I've also learned a lot about snakes just from reading the things the comments and stuff that people make on there. Then there's the last one there, Texas Nature Trackers, which is another, well, it's not the last one on the list, is it? Anyway, Texas Nature Trackers is part of Texas Parks and Wildlife, and it's just another nature trackers, like it says. People put in their observations of what they've seen, and people go there to see what there is to be seen. That's really about it. I hope you've enjoyed this quick look at Texas Master Naturalist. I hope maybe if you weren't familiar with it, you've learned something and it's interesting enough to you that you might want to pursue it and see about maybe finding a chapter near you. There's so many opportunities for really neat stuff you can do on even a smaller scale. I have to admit, I'm a little bit envious because I would love to have a bunch of acres to work with, but I don't. So I hope y'all enjoy all your using all your new stuff that you've learned, and I thank you for your time. That's really all I have.
All right. Well, thank you, Olivia. We appreciate that. If anybody's got a question or comment, either unmute your mic or type it in the chat. I am going to share one thing real quick. If I can share my screen, y'all should be able to see this now. There it goes. So I shared a link to this website in the chat. It's just the Texas Master Naturalist website, but you can see they got this map you can go to where the chapters are at. So if y'all are down in Polk County, in my neck of the woods, we're in the Pineywood Lakes Master Chapter, so we cover Polk, Trinity, San Jacinto, and Tyler County. But if y'all are up in the northeast part of the state, there's the Red River chapter, and there's the East Texas chapter, and the Cypress Basin chapter. So if y'all are interested in joining the Master Naturalist, just go find this website and look up the link and work with y'all. I highly recommend, if y'all are really interested in doing wildlife management and learning a lot of things, is to get involved in the Master Naturalist chapter, because you will learn a lot of information that you'll be able to use on your own land and to educate your neighbors and other people. So with that, I have nothing else, unless if anybody else has anything else. We finished a few minutes early, so y'all can get to go home early. Well, I guess most of y'all are already home already.
I hate to